There we go. Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next Life as a Postdoc talk. I just briefly, before we go ahead and get started, wanted to mention some of the upcoming events that our committee is involved with. HMPA is doing an immigration webinar tomorrow that we posted about in the Slack channel. You can find more information here. That's at 9 a.m. on Zoom. And then on December 1st, there will be another immigration webinar that we're hosting at noon on Zoom. We'll be sending out details about that in the near future. And then we have another one scheduled for mid-February, which we'll send you about information about in the future as well. If you're interested in being a part of our committee, we would love to have you. You can email me. I put my email here. I'll also put in the chat once we get started. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce the reason that everyone's here. Dr. Tim Sainburg is going to talk to us about his very interesting work in looking at postdocs. And Tim got his BA in psychology with a minor in biology at Penn State in 2014. And then he got his PhD at the University of California, San Diego in 2021 in psychology. And currently he's a postdoc at Harvard Medical School. And with that, Tim, go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Zeki, and thanks everyone for having me here. So I'm going to be talking about a paper that I wrote last year called American Postdoctoral Salaries Do Not Account for Growing Disparities in Cost of Living. And so the whole talk is about postdoc salaries and their relationship with cost of living in different cities. And the paper is right now in its second round of review, so hopefully it'll be out soon. If you want to look at it now, it's on archive. As Zeki mentioned, I'm a postdoc in Harvard Medical School in the neurobiology department. So I arrived here in Boston earlier this year. And the whole project was driven by just a general curiosity when I learned how expensive it is to live here in Boston. And so I did this work in winter of 2021. And since then, there have actually been some successes in changing postdoc salaries here in Boston, which is largely thanks to you guys. And we can talk about at the end. I also wanted to say I'm not an expert in this area of research. This all started as basically a data science project for fun, and that there are people in this meeting who spent years working on these issues. So I invite them to pitch in and throughout the talk, and just everyone else, if they have questions, to speak up and ask questions throughout. And the story is really particularly interesting and relevant to us here in Boston. So some of you may have seen these recent headlines that Boston overtook San Francisco as being the second most expensive city in the United States to rent an apartment. And the story is actually really simple. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to spell out the story in words. Then I'm going to tell you why it's important that we need to correct this problem. And then I'm going to show you some data and some results. And finally, we can talk about how to fix the problem. So first, summarizing the story. Some American cities cost a lot more than others. So I'm sure you all knew this kind of coming into this, but that's cost of living, right? It costs more to live in some places than others. American jobs generally pay proportional to the cost of living. And economics for that, the term for that is called spatial equilibrium. So for example, the median teacher salary for a K-12 teacher in San Francisco is around $83,000. And in Durham, it's around $48,000 at the time of writing this paper. But what I find actually is that postdocs are not receiving salaries proportional to the cost of living. So the median postdoc salary in San Francisco, for example, is $59,000 versus $43,000 in Durham, North Carolina. And then the next thing I find is that postdocing in these expensive cities actually yields better chances at landing a tenure track job, but you're getting paid less. So basically postdocing is an investment. Doing your postdoc is an investment in a good job. And that the gap between your salary in these more expensive cities and these less expensive cities is actually increasing over the past few decades. And so the question is then, why does that information matter? And I think that there's actually a couple of reasons for why this is important. The first is really simple. So we live here in Boston, which is one of the most expensive cities in America. And we want to be able to be sure that we can live comfortably on our salaries. And we want to be able to advocate to be able to get our salaries to account for how expensive these different cities are. And that's the original reason that I started looking into this data. The second reason I think is actually a bit more complicated of an argument, but I think it's actually more important. And that is by paying postdocs lower salaries, we're actually filtering out the type of people that end up staying in academia. And so many of you have likely heard of the leaky pipeline in academia. So this is our name for science's problem with diversity, basically. We find that as career stages progress, academia becomes more white and more male, filtering out women and minorities. And so it's basically important to figure out what's causing those leaks in the pipeline. And I'm going to argue that postdoc salaries are actually one of those causes. So in this work, I'm basically trying to make the argument that pay disparity during your postdoc is one of the sources of this leaky pipeline. So again, doing a postdoc is an investment toward getting a tenure track position and running a lab, and that not everybody can afford that investment. So for example, parents, people with student loans, and people without a financial safety net are less able to make that investment. Higher prestige labs, which exist in these more expensive cities, are better investments. They give you a higher probability of getting a tenure track job. And that these higher prestige labs are actually paying less relative to the cost of living in a city. And so basically what happens is that this filters out people who can't take on that investment. So basically it's a leak in the pipeline. Okay, so before I talk about the actual results of the study, I just briefly want to mention what the data is that we're using here to make those arguments. The analyses that we're doing are basically based on two data sets, both from federal sources. So the first one is retrieved from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA, and contains the regional price parity. So basically the regional price parity is a measure of the cost of living each year. The BEA is releasing this for each city, and it's a weighted average of the price of goods like food, medical care, housing, and transportation. So it's basically measured in the same way that we measure inflation, but in this case, it's the cost of those things relative to the location you live in rather than the year that you live in. So basically, it's the relative value of a dollar given where you live. So in San Francisco, a dollar buys you less than in Houston. Then the second data set we're looking at is a data set of 27,000 postdoc salaries over a 5-year period. And the way that I acquired that data set is basically that the Department of Labor requires that universities and every institution, every company reports what they intend to pay an employee when they come into the United States through an H-1B visa. So basically, we're looking at only H-1B postdocs. That's valuable to us because basically every university in America is hiring H-1B postdocs. So this is a really nice loophole for getting salary data that normally isn't publicly available, like from private universities. And in fact, even most public universities are difficult to get salary data from. And then finally, we have a few other data sets that we use for comparison, all from federal sources, except this Colorado Boulder data set, which has faculty hiring statistics, which we're going to touch on in a bit later. Okay, so now we're going to start with this basic question. Do your wages as a postdoc account for cost of living differences across cities? So in other words, if I'm a postdoc in an expensive city like Boston, is my salary high enough to enjoy a similar quality of life as my postdoc friend in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or Durham, North Carolina? So this is a map that I showed you earlier of the regional price parity, which is again a metric for the cost of living across university towns in America. So each of these different shaded regions is a university town. So you can see that the Bay Area is more expensive than, say, Texas. New York is more expensive than Pittsburgh. And here in Boston, we have a regional price parity of 115.5, which again means that things cost about 15.5% more in Boston than in the average place in America. The median postdoc salary in Boston at the time of this study was $55,500, which was 2021, late 2021. And so knowing that median salary and knowing your regional price parity, we can calculate what's called the real salary, which is an economic term meant to estimate how much your salary is actually worth in the place that you live. And we're calculating this in the exact same way that the BEA does, just by dividing your salary by Boston's regional price parity. And so that gives Boston a median real salary for postdocs of $48,000. Since the cost of living is high in Boston, the real salary ends up being a bit lower than that median salary. And so in contrast, if we look at a city like Pittsburgh, where the cost of living is low, 8% lower here than across the rest of the United States, real salaries are actually higher than the median salary. So we have a real salary of $56,000 compared to a median salary of $51,800. So basically what that means is around an $8,000 difference in how far your salary will go if you are a postdoc in Boston versus a postdoc in Pittsburgh. Of course, Boston and Pittsburgh are just two examples. And so, of course, we can collect that same data across all the different universities, all the different towns and cities in the United States. And so with that data, we can ask questions about how salary and cost of living are related. So now we're going to use that data to test a hypothesis based on a concept from urban economics called spatial equilibrium. So basically, spatial equilibrium is predicting a compensatory equality between income, prices, and amenities. What does that mean? What that means is that as cost of living increases, wages are expected to rise too, because if I offer you $100,000 to do the same job in San Francisco or in Chicago, you're probably going to choose to live in Chicago and take that Chicago job, because $100,000 goes a lot further in Chicago than it does in San Francisco. So I'm going to need to offer you more money to take a San Francisco job than to take a Chicago job. And so spatial equilibrium predicts that regardless of where you live, your real salary should remain about the same if you're doing the same job. And we find this to be generally true across the United States and actually the rest of the world. So this is a well-studied phenomenon. And so what we're interested in this paper is whether the same phenomena holds true for postdoc salaries, whether your real salary remains constant regardless of your cost of living. So now I'm going to do this analysis here. So we're looking at the regional price parity, again, a metric of cost of living on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis, your annual salary. And I'm comparing two things, the median postdoc salary in a given location and the median salary across the general labor market in those same cities and those same towns. So first I'm showing you the annual salary, the median salary of just your average person in each of these university towns. And so what you see is that the salary goes up as a function of cost of living, as we would expect. So in these less expensive towns, your annual average median salary, someone living in that town is closer to $40,000. In these more expensive towns, the median salary is $60,000. So this is probably Manhattan up here, where the median salary in 2021 is going to be around $61,000, $62,000. So this general upward trend. And now when we look at postdoc salaries in those same cities, we see an upward trend still. So it's less of an upward trend, but still an upward trend. So in these more expensive cities like New York or Boston, we are getting paid a little bit more as postdocs, but less of an increase than we see with the general labor market. Something else that's interesting to note here is that in these cheaper places, postdocs are actually paid considerably more than the median person in these less expensive cities and towns. But in places like Boston or San Francisco, we're actually getting paid about the same as the median person in these cities. And so now to test the spatial equilibrium hypothesis, let's take those same salaries and adjust them to now the real salaries. Now on the y-axis, we're plotting the real salary rather than the median salary. So this is again adjusted for cost of living. And again, still on the x-axis, we have the regional price parity, which you can think of as the cost of living index, with 100 being the median for America. And what we find in this broader labor market, so this is the same data plotted again, is that as regional price parity increases, as cost of living increases, your real salary remains about the same for the broader labor market. We don't see an increase there. So real salary stays about the same. So let's look at postdocs now. Now we see a very different story, right? We find this big downward trend. And basically what that's telling us is that postdocs in more expensive cities are making relatively less money than postdocs in cheaper cities. So you're doing pretty well if you're a postdoc in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where your median salary is quite high. And you're not doing so well if you're a postdoc in Manhattan, where your real salary is going to be actually a lot lower. So in other words, postdoc salaries don't follow that general spatial equilibrium principle, which lies in contrast with the general labor market. And so this is basically what I consider to be the main result of this paper. And then the rest of the paper, the rest of the results that I'm going to talk about today are kind of digging into this. So now is actually a good point to ask any questions if anybody in the room has them. Otherwise, I can just move on.
If no one has any questions, I do have one. So maybe you'll talk about this, but how much of this do you think comes from the fact that a lot of universities key off of stuff like the NIH minimum, which doesn't adjust for cost of living?
Yeah, totally. I think that the answer to that is very much so. It's something that I talk a little bit about in this paper, but I really haven't talked about. I don't think I put any slides about it here at all. But basically, yeah, the most universities, when I was trying to collect this data, what I found, and I'm sure what you have all experienced as well, is that people seem to, universities seem to track their salaries to the NRSA stipend levels, which are not scaled with cost of living. So NRSA stipends are actually the same, and for anyone, regardless of the university you come from, which is actually really problematic if you're an NRSA postdoc here in a city like Boston, where $55,000 doesn't go nearly as far as it does in Durham, North Carolina. And it's actually made even more difficult when we have these constraints on how, say, NRSA postdocs can be paid, where you can't use federal money to supplement those NRSA postdocs to account for things like cost of living. So I think that the NRSA stipend levels are driving a lot of that. If you were to, tell something, and actually I tried to reach out to folks from the NIH before to kind of explain, what their role in this is. And basically what I've heard is that the NRSA postdoc levels aren't supposed to be the basis for everyone else, setting their postdoc stipend levels, but we still do use them, and also that they're in universities, they're generally minimums and not maximums, or they're not forcing us to use those levels. But the fact that universities are using them is certainly problematic. I'm sure other people in the room have opinions too if they want to weigh in.
Yeah, does anyone from the room have comments or questions? You can feel free. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have one question for them. So you mentioned that you collected this data from H-1B visa holders, but majority of the postdocs are holding J1, which are not their income is not in the records of IIS. Is it safe to assume that because to reach H-1B level, to get an H-1B visa, you need to pass like 13 years of experience level, and in the meantime, your salary is supposed to go higher. So is it safe to assume that the general picture is even more grim than?
Is it safe to assume that? I would probably assume that. I don't know that it's the case because I don't have access to those data. Actually, there are like smaller data sets that we could have access to, like postdoc salaries are publicly reported in a couple of universities. So it would be possible to kind of compare these two things. But yeah, my guess is actually that the salaries that we're showing here are a little bit higher than the general postdoc population.
Any other questions from the audience? If not, I think you can continue, Tim.
Okay. I realized that I didn't actually look at how long we were expecting this talk to go for, but we're about probably halfway done at this point, maybe a little bit less. So just to give you an indicator, I'm not sure how long these talks usually go. I guess I'm number 2, so maybe I'm setting a standard now by talking a certain length of time. But yeah, so the next question for you is really, why would you choose to work in a place like New York or Boston when you could be working in a place like Pittsburgh or Dallas and be making a lot more money relative to where you live, making a higher salary? And so basically what I'm about to show you is that cities like Boston and New York are actually better career investments, even though they make you less money. So before I mentioned that spatial equilibrium is predicting a compensatory equality between the cost of living, the wages that you're making, and the amenities that you have. And I haven't talked about amenities yet, but you can think about this better career investment as being one of those amenities. You have a better probability of successfully landing a tenure track job in these more expensive cities. So I'm going to show you some data confirming that. So in this plot, I'm showing you all the cities in the US ranked ordered by the number of tenure track faculty that they've produced. And this is again from that Colorado Boulder data set I mentioned earlier. So you'll notice that for the most part, these top ranking cities here are just big cities. So Boston, New York, Chicago. So this isn't actually very meaningful yet. So next to it, I'm plotting the ratio of tenure track faculty relative to PhDs produced. The reason I'm plotting PhDs produced and not postdoc produced is just because I don't have access to that data, but these are highly correlated. So it's basically tenure track faculty relative to trainees. So if you have a higher ratio, a ratio higher than 1-to-1, that means that that city is overproducing tenure track faculty. It's conferring a greater chance of a tenure track job relative to the number of people that they're producing. So basically what we find is that for the most part, these big cities like Boston and New York and San Francisco are actually conveying a greater chance of getting a tenure track job, one exception here being LA. And as you might expect, these cities are also are more expensive places to live. Again, we're measuring that by the regional price parity, where Boston is 15.5% higher, more expensive than the average place in America. And that's true of generally all of these cities that are producing greater numbers of postdocs. And at this point, you could probably guess what these cities' real postdoc salaries are. They're generally lower than the median, right? Boston is a few $1,000s less than the median salary. New York, same thing. Bay Area, same thing. And so the biggest disparities we're seeing are around a $15,000 to $20,000 gap. The one exception in these 10 best producers of postdoc cities is Durham, Chapel Hill, where they're actually making a little bit more than the median postdoc. So the difference between Boston and Chapel Hill being, around $7,000 or $8,000. And so we can do the same analysis for individual universities as well. So here I'm showing universities ranked ordered by the number of faculty that they produce relative to the number of trainees, where UChicago is overproducing the highest number of faculty. We also have some Boston schools like MIT and Harvard are also overproducing faculty. And as you probably guessed again, many of these universities that are producing outsized number of tenure track faculty are also paying postdocs less money. So the takeaway here is that even though these cities and universities are potentially good career investments, they are investments. So you're taking a financial loss to do your postdoc here. And so now we've established that postdoc salaries don't scale with cost of living and that you're paying to do your postdoc in Boston. So the next thing I wanted to know is, has that always been the case, or is this a new problem, or is this a growing problem? So first, let's look at postdoc salaries over the past 4 decades. I don't have access to historical H-1B data, so now we're looking at the NIH NRSA salary over time. And I'm going to inflate the salaries to 2021 dollars to make the salary comparison easier. But we're looking from 1984 to 2021, so about 4 decades. So basically what we find is that salaries have generally been in the same range of those years, somewhere between around $50,000 and $60,000 per year. They bottomed out in the late 90s and then jumped back up in the mid 2000s. So if your PI was trained in the 90s, they probably didn't have a great postdoc salary. But then in the mid 2000s, if they're a younger PI, they might have made a little bit more money as a postdoc. But generally, postdoc salaries have remained fairly constant over the years. And so next, how does the relative cost of living between cities change over time? So again, same time range, 1984 to 2021. And on the y-axis here, we're plotting the CPI relative to US average. So the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, measures the relative cost of living in a place over time. So it's basically the same thing as the regional price parity, but now relative to time rather than relative to space. So here I'm showing 7 cities in the United States where I show the change in cost of living over this same time period, where gray is the average change in cost of living in America. And so if you're above this gray line, that means that you've become more expensive over the past few decades relative to the rest of the United States. And if you're below this gray line, you become less expensive. So you can see here with San Francisco that it's become relatively more expensive over the past 4 decades than the United States, whereas Houston has gotten relatively cheaper. And if we fill in, San Diego, Boston, San Francisco, New York, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Houston, we see this kind of diversity where these classic kind of university cities like San Diego, like the Bay Area, Boston, New York are becoming more expensive over time relative to the rest of the states, and Chicago and Houston are actually becoming less expensive. And so finally, because that's kind of a more opaque sort of metric, the consumer price index, let's just ground that in something that's very easy to comprehend. So we're just going to look at the price of a 2-bedroom apartment in each of these cities. So this is the fair market rents, which is around the 40th percentile apartment, 2-bedroom apartment, again, scaling to 2021 dollars to make the comparison more easy for us who are on the housing market in the 2020s. So in Pittsburgh, the price of a 2-bedroom apartment scaled for inflation has stayed around constant in 2021 dollars. It's around $1,000 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment. Whereas in San Francisco, of course, the price has sort of gone up and up and up, where in 2021 dollars, the cost of an apartment would have been $1,400, $1,500 in 1984, and now it's like $3,400, so a huge increase. And so looking across cities again, we see this diversity of price changes. So Boston again has increased a lot, New York has increased a lot, San Francisco has increased a lot, and then Chicago, Houston, Pittsburgh have stayed a little bit lower. So if we put all that together, we start to see this trend in time where postdoc salaries have fluctuated but stayed relatively constant. And cities like San Francisco, Boston, and New York have become increasingly expensive relative to the rest of the United States, which we can see broadly with the consumer price index and also specific examples like the price of a 2-bedroom apartment. So factor in this temporal information with our main result that postdoc salaries don't obey spatial equilibrium, and we see a trend over the past 4 decades where expensive cities are becoming more expensive, and postdoc salaries just aren't keeping up with those changes in those cities. So in other words, the gap between more expensive cities and less expensive cities has been increasing for postdocs over that time, or at least we can assume it's been increasing for postdocs over that time. And so basically, to summarize these results, some American cities, as we knew beforehand, cost more than others. American jobs generally pay proportional to the cost of living. So that was the gray line in that first figure that I showed you. And postdocs don't receive salaries that are proportional to cost of living like we saw in that broader labor market. But we also found, however, that doing a postdoc in these more expensive cities yields a better chance at landing a tenure-track job, despite the fact that you get paid less. So postdocing is actually still a good investment. And then finally, the gap in salary between these expensive cities and these cheaper cities is actually increasing. And so to reiterate the argument in this work, low pay is basically filtering out specific people out of academia. So doing a postdoc, again, is an investment toward getting that tenure-track job that not everybody can afford. If you're in different financial situations, you're not able to afford that, which is affecting different groups differently. And so higher prestige labs in these expensive cities become better investments and give you a higher probability of getting a tenure-track job, but they pay less. And basically that's filtering out certain people. If you're not willing to accept that lower salary during, most of us are in our late 20s to early 40s, during that kind of critical period in our lives, which is getting larger and larger over time, we're just not going to be going into our postdocs, and so we're kind of filtering out diversity out of academia through these lower salaries. And so then finally, the question is basically, how do we fix it? And basically, I'm not going to pretend to have a single answer here. There are people in this Zoom room who have been working really hard to fix these things, which is really awesome. But the 2 questions that kind of pop out to me are who do we advocate to? So do we advocate to our PIs, to our universities, or our funding institutions, and also where does that money come from? And I think that the answer is basically to advocate to all 3 of those, your PI, your university, and your funding sources at the same time. Because universities are generally setting salary minimums and not maximums, but they can also make it really hard for your PI to increase your salary. So in some cases, PIs aren't even allowed to increase salaries over the standard that the university sets, which makes it hard for the PI and makes it a good reason to advocate to your university. But you can also, ask your PI for a higher salary and explain to them, you live in a more expensive city. But also the funding institutions are a big part of the problem. So as we alluded to earlier, the NIH in particular makes it really difficult for universities and PIs to raise salaries relative to the rest of the United States, even if you're in these more expensive places. So, you know, the NRSA is the de facto standard for postdoc salaries. And it just doesn't care about where you live. You get paid the same NRSA salary if you're in Des Moines, Iowa versus Boston versus Manhattan, right? And they also make it harder to make to supplement that money when you live in different places. So you can actually take a loss when you're getting an RSA, and that's even on top of different support packages, benefits that you get when you become a stipendee postdoc versus a salaried postdoc. But the good news is that universities are starting to raise salary levels for postdocs, and that's largely to thanks to the work of people again in the Zoom room. And I really think that at the end of the day, one of the bigger things that we can do is produce data on salary information and academic outcomes, and continue to present those data to funders. So as Ezra mentioned a couple of minutes ago, you know, the data that I'm presenting here is just kind of lucky data that we have access to, right? Like nobody made this data available because they wanted us to know what postdoc salaries look like. They made it available because it's, you know, this is just something that we do with H-1B visas. If we had access to salary data for universities beyond just H-1B postdocs, and also if we were keeping better track of academic outcomes and things like gender and race and family status, we would have more information about how our academic outcomes are impacted by things like our salary, and how those are impacting other people differently. So I think that continuing to make these data available is kind of fundamental to fixing these problems. So with that, thank you. Thanks to all of you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any more questions that you have.
Hiya. Does anyone have any questions? You can feel free to unmute if you do.
Sorry, I have like maybe not so directly related question. Is that, does it hold also for PhD?
I think it does, but I didn't have data here to support that. I think there have been a couple of papers that have tried to address that, and I do think that PhD salaries are tied less to NRSA stipends and seem to be a bit more variable, but I do believe that there have been some recent papers that have shown that PhDs are getting hit by the same problems.
Just like a side note is that I'm from Norway, and the situation there is that the gap between PhD and postdoc is so marginally. It's very, very similar to your data, but it's not like comparing cities, but comparing from PhD and postdoc.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
Yeah. You know, and another jump that actually I have another slide right here that I can jump to is like, you know, we've been talking about differences of, you know, 20% or so in salaries between, you know, postdocs in one city versus another. But, you know, to contextualize, like if you're a life science postdoc and you choose to go to industry, you know, this is a 2020 survey, the NSF survey of doctorates. In 2020, a postdoc was paid about $50,000 on average, whereas a first-year postdoc, whereas a first-year PhD going into industry was paid about $100,000 on average. So now we're talking about a 50%, you know, difference in salary. So to some extent, these numbers that we're talking about are relatively small relative to the difference between postdocs and industry, but I do still think that they're pretty significant, and I agree that the jump between PhDs stipends and postdoc stipends is a pretty big gap.
Yeah, agree. Thank you.
Are there any more questions from people in the audience?
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much. This is really great. You brought up the survey of earned doctorates there, and somebody just messaged me the other day about changes in postdoc numbers depending on where they're going. And what's interesting is that it seems like the most recent data are showing there's a similar number of people who are postdocing. You know, we're in this age where people are talking about the great postdoc shortage, and there are few people postdocing. But it looks like we have the same number of postdocs, but that more of those postdocs are in industry, and this is changing over time. So I'm curious if you have a sense of the sort of, it's harder to get the industry numbers for salary by location. Do you have any sense of whether that is changing and how that might be affecting, and whether it might correlate, whether they do have cost of living adjustments as well? Yeah, I'm just curious of from the industry side. Yeah,
that's a really interesting question. When I was collecting the H-1B data set, I filtered out any industry postdocs that I had, because I was only looking at universities, and the data set of spatial locations I had were just for universities, so I just kind of threw that data out. But that data does exist, so like H-1B Facebook postdocs are in that data set and could be looked at. I would guess that they account for cost of living. And in fact, like when you look at those industry postdocs, like those numbers were pretty high. I did look at the numbers, but I didn't look at where they were like spatially. And like people were making, 6-figure salaries as postdocs in a lot of those industry positions. So I imagine that they're affected less by cost of living differences.
And then I think to Ezra's question before, am I right in saying for H-1B visas, there's a salary minimum that's applied to get the H-1B? Does that hold for nonprofits?
I don't know. I actually never looked into that. That's an interesting insight.
Yeah,
But
go ahead.
What I was trying to say that you get your H-1B after finishing your 5 years with J1. So your starting minimum is, if you're paid by NH, minimum is 52, but by the time you get to J1, you already reached 60. But that $88,000 is not taken into account in the mean average calculations, because J1 visa holders are not, I think the first 2 years, they are not paying taxes anyways. I think, or there is something different that you can't get, I think, the data from IRS on J1 visa holders. So I think it is shifting the average salary for postdocs a little bit upwards than it is when J1 visa holders are taken into account altogether. That's why I was thinking, is it safe to assume that the general picture is even grimmer, because we know there are many postdocs, they are not even paid by NIH minimum, below NIH minimum they're getting paid.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. If I had to venture a guess, which again, I don't have the data, like I would guess that the slope of those curves that we saw would probably stay pretty similar, but the intercept would go down a bit, right? Like the average salary goes down when we look at average postdocs, but the effect of where you live probably isn't going to change that much.
And I have one more question, Tim. Have you ever considered looking at the same data with the comparison? What is the low income level per state versus what is the postdoc average salary? Because for example, I know in Boston, in order to pass that low income level, you have to work 5 years. Meaning if you're an American citizen, you're eligible for social housing.
Yeah.
At an intellectual educational level as high as postdoc, you're eligible for social housing in Boston.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So I was wondering if it is possible to do like this kind of matching, low income level per state versus postdoc salary.
Yeah, I mean, that if the data would be publicly available, I assume, so totally, yeah, that would be a valuable analysis to do.
Yeah, I think that data is published under from the housing and urban development is typically where you can find it. So that's where we were able to find the numbers for Boston. So, but I'm assuming, I think they publish it like region by region. So I think that should be available countrywide.
Yeah.
One other thing I was thinking about was I saw a talk recently from someone at Howard Hughes Medical Institution who talked pretty explicitly about the fact that they tend to fund only people at coastal institutions in the US. And I wonder whether one part of this, the prestige of the places tends to be coastal places, right? Coastal cities in particular are where the success seems to happen. And whether one factor in this is who is getting the money, or is, how the money connects with the prestige in there. Yeah, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, totally, like another read of this whole, result that we found here is like, maybe this isn't a bad thing, right? Like maybe the fact that we're getting paid less money in coastal cities should just be seen as an incentive for people to move to those cheaper places. Like, why are we, why are we doing postdocs in these more expensive places? Which, of course, a secondary kind of justification is that, these prestigious universities are out here in these more expensive cities. But I think that you're totally right that the reason that we're not moving to these less expensive institutions is because these places are more, prestigious, and we're able, they're able to fund more postdocs. We're able to get more postdocs there, and ultimately, like, for whatever reason, universities in Boston are more likely to have R1s that they can pay postdocs with, so we end up being here. That would be a really interesting, data set to get and to analyze in relation to this data.
Are there any other questions? If not, let's go ahead and thank our speaker again. Thank you, Tim, for the excellent talk. Yeah, it certainly gave me a lot to think about. Like, seeing that plot just like diving down was not, it's, I guess, what I expected, but also like way worse than I expected. So